Today we're talking about engine failures after takeoff, or even a rough running engine after takeoff, the worst time for something like this to happen. We'll give you tips on what to do in such a situation and how to keep yourself alive. Welcome to the Flying Reporter Pilot Briefing. So welcome along to today's pilot briefing, and a bit of a different format today. Firstly, you'll note that I'm in a different location. I'm actually in a hotel room near Dublin in Ireland. I'm doing some filming in the next few days, so I've come over for that. Another difference in the format is that rather than it being a scripted briefing, which is how I normally do these things, I thought we'd do it in a more conversational style. But for it to be a conversation, I need someone to talk to. And I've got Matt Lane with me from Astral Aviation Consulting. Hi, Matt.
Hi, John. Great to be with you this afternoon.
Now, some of you might know that Astral Aviation Consulting, they're the UK CAA's safety partner for GA. They produce lots of workshops and information to help us fly safely. Matt works for them, and he's been helping me behind the scenes over the last few months, putting these briefings together, helping me understand some of this stuff, helping me pick some of the topics that we talk about. And I thought today it would be a good idea to bring Matt into a conversational type briefing, because he's got such a wealth of experience and knowledge, and he can perhaps make us have more value out of these briefings. So Matt, I mean, first of all, perhaps introduce yourself to our listener or viewer here so that they know who you are and what you do.
Yes, Matt Lane, experienced single and multi-FI and examiner. I am fortunate enough to instruct and examine a lot of clubs around West Oxfordshire, both at some civilian clubs and with the military as well, where I still fly as a reservist on the University Air Squadron. So I get to do a range of flying, both from some basic flying instruction and examining, right up to some of the more advanced stuff, actually training instructors and some Air Force cadets as well. So very fortunate to do that, and experience of flying a variety of aircraft. And it's been great working with John and others on the team doing some of the Astral briefings and webinars as well. And I've seen and engaged with a number of people all over the UK and Europe actually as part of that as well, which has been a fantastic experience recently.
Now, later in the podcast, I know you're going to tell us about some of the changes affecting flight training. We're going to be talking about qualifying cross countries and some changes perhaps, or certainly some clarification around those, and also the pilot refresher training for the revalidation of a class rating, and some changes around that as well. But first, I wanted to talk about engine failures after takeoff, or partial power, a rough running engine after takeoff. I wondered if that's ever happened to you.
It has. I've had one full engine failure, as in engine completely mechanically failed, but I've had a number of partial power losses, rough running and insidious losses of power as well. So I have experienced it back when I was a student and instructing a little bit as well. So yeah, it's definitely something that's out there that can catch us, John.
Well, the reason for me bringing this up today, and I thought it was a good subject for the briefing, is that I'd seen a couple of air accident investigation reports around partial power or engine failures after takeoff. And in both cases, the people on board survived the crashes, but they were seriously injured. And I was going to run through one of them quickly, and perhaps you can then summarise the other, Matt, and then we can go through the issues. So the first accident involved a Jabiru UL450, which is a two-seat high-wing kit aeroplane that's made its first flight, this particular aircraft, in 2006, so not terribly old. It took off from Damins Hall Aerodrome in April last year with the pilot and their passenger on board. During the departure, the pilot noticed that the aircraft was not climbing as well as expected, and at 300 feet they determined that the engine wasn't developing full power. They felt that they didn't have enough height to return to the airfield, and there wasn't anywhere suitable ahead to land. The airspeed was falling rapidly, they say, and so they then retracted the flaps to see if that would help them gain airspeed. The pilot remembered that it all went quiet, the wings waggled a bit, and then the aircraft just dropped. That's how they described it. They didn't recall hearing the stall warner going off at all. Now, the aircraft stalled and entered a spin before striking the ground, and it crashed into a wooded area nearly 400 metres from the end of the runway. The cause of the engine failure couldn't be conclusively proved, but the AAIB says it was probably caused by a split in the rubber coupling attachment for the carburettor. Now, there was a lot of commentary in this report about this technical problem and the cause of this engine failure, and it's worth reading actually. However, I'm not going to go into that today because I want to focus on the pilot's actions in this. That's what I wanted to pull out of this report. Now, the first thing that I thought was interesting was that before flight, the pilot was using a checklist when doing their sort of pre-takeoff power checks. But this checklist wasn't actually an accurate or full duplication of the manufacturer's checklist. For example, it didn't provide a target speed that the pilot should look for when doing the power checks, the RPM that is. It also didn't prompt them to do an idle power check or to check the carburetor heat was functioning properly. So some important checks there, or parts of the checklist that weren't followed. The report questions that whether had the pilot actually used the proper checklist or an accurate depiction of the checklist, would they have noticed they had a problem? It's possible, isn't it? And this accident could have been avoided. Then the other interesting thing is that on the climb out, the pilot and the passenger said they didn't hear the stall warner going off. Now, this was quite interesting to me. The AAIB says that it probably was going off, but the pilot and the passenger probably was suffering from something that they call inattentional deafness. I wonder if you've heard of that, Matt.
It is something that I've heard of because the human factors and the medic people tell me losing your hearing in high stress, it's the first of your senses to go. So it's definitely something that I think can be a factor in these accidents.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've noticed in situations where I've been under high stress, I haven't fully processed or absorbed any ATC instructions. It kind of gets put to the back of your mind and you forget you've heard it. So I found that quite interesting. The report, of course, noted that the pilot retracted the flaps when they thought they weren't gaining airspeed. And the report investigation said that actually that would have reduced lift and probably would have made the situation worse. They were already at a low airspeed. So we'll come back and discuss some of the points in this report in a moment, but I know you've been looking at another case, and this was a partial power situation after takeoff. So talk me through that case that has just come out in this new report.
So this one was in February 2024. It was near RAF Mona in Anglesey, and it was an Aerosport Scamp, which if people aren't familiar with, it's a high drag, pretty low inertia light aircraft, and it's got a relatively small margin between the climb speed of 65 knots and the stall speed at 47. So it's quite a tricky aircraft to handle. It had been in a long restoration. And we've got a really experienced pilot, 50 years old, air transport pilot's licence with nearly 5,000 hours there. So this gentleman flying, he's very experienced, but it's only his fourth flight in the aircraft after a major restoration. So he's basically getting back into doing some of the kind of the permit flight tests and things like that as well. Now, he took off from the runway, but as he got to about 400 feet AGL, the RPM decreased significantly and he had some rough running as well. So the pilot did exactly the right thing by lowering the nose to maintain his airspeed, but the aircraft did descend slightly to 300 feet during this as well. So he was preparing to make a forced landing in the field beyond the end of the runway. Again, exactly the right things to do. But as he was just preparing to do that, the engine returned to full power without any intervention from the pilot. With the engine now producing power, the pilot decided to fly a tight right-hand circuit, which he was considering was giving him the opportunity to land downwind on the runway if necessary. And as the aircraft entered the downwind leg, we're now up to 600 feet AGL, but the engine power then totally decreased to idle with significant rough running. So it's really gone wrong on him again. The pilot lowered the nose below the horizon. He was too low to reach the airfield, and he selected a field to land in. But as he was doing his field selection, he felt the aircraft stall with a right wing drop, and he had to pitch the nose further down to recover, but he was now too low to reach his selected field. And at this point, the engine has now stopped. He got a residential area ahead, high rate of descent. So he picked an open area of gardens with a line of trees to land in, and he intentionally stalled the aircraft into the tree line. He hit the trees. The aircraft came to rest on its right-hand side. It slid out of the trees. But the pilot miraculously fractured wrist and some minor injuries, noting he was wearing a helmet and some other protection. So he got away fairly lightly. So really challenging set of circumstances that the pilot was faced with, and he had a number of things to face here, and I think he did a great job to make the best of a bad set of options that he had available to him, but quite a complex scenario. It's not a straight bang, the engine stopped, land ahead. This gentleman had a bunch of things to deal with and a changing circumstance as well, so it's quite an interesting one to read.
Yeah, and I think that's why I highlighted these two, because this is quite a big problem. I think the AAIB say that in the 10 years from 2011 to 2021, they had to complete 16 field investigations following accidents involving partial power or partial loss of power. And in those 16 accidents, there were 15 fatalities and 9 serious or life-threatening injuries. A major problem and a significant cause of fatalities in aircraft incidents. And I mean, loss of control is certainly the biggest cause of aircraft accidents, I think.
Absolutely.
And partial power is clearly contributed to that in a lot of these cases. The AAIB actually has published some recommendations for the CAA, asking them to include partial power in flight training, and also the kind of proficiency check training. They're still working on that. The CAA has published some safety sense leaflets covering stalls and spins. It's held some workshops, I think, on partial power. But I know that the instructor community is doing quite a lot to introduce this partial power situation into training and the kind of training for revalidation. Both of these cases highlight the difficulty of taking off from somewhere, having some kind of engine problem, and then not being able to find somewhere to put down. In the first case, the pilot was faced with a forest of trees. The second pilot found a field when the power initially stopped, regained power, climbed, turned downwind or headed downwind, and then the field that they were aiming for they couldn't actually reach, as it turned out. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that. I mean, I suppose we're told, aren't we, to keep flying, no matter what it looks like out the window. Keep flying, keep control of the aircraft.
Absolutely, and staying in control is got to be your absolute number one priority in any kind of emergency situation. You've got to prioritise flying the aircraft, and that all comes from selecting and maintaining a suitable attitude. So if you've got the attitude outside that you know and have practiced in that, you're going to be able to keep the aircraft flying, keep a safe angle of attack over the wings, and keep in control and try and avoid that stall situation. Because like you say, John, spins, things like that, it all starts from the stall. So if we can maintain a safe attitude, maintain a safe flying speed, that's going to help us stay in control.
Yeah, even if what you're looking at out the window, it's not very nice to look at. Just keep flying the aeroplane. I mean, in the case of the second pilot that you mentioned, they weren't going to be able to make the field that they'd identified, and the danger would have been, of course, that they tried to stretch the glide and ended up stalling. They landed roughly into a garden, but it would have possibly been worse had they tried to stretch the glide and stalled.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things that is particularly challenging is, and this comes up a lot in the turn back debate, people talk and pilots talk a lot about turning back towards the airfield in an engine failure situation, but if you have any residual power available in a partial engine failure situation, people think they have to get back to the airfield that they took off from or the runway surfaces. Well, that's not really the priority. The priority is about getting to somewhere that is, as you alluded to earlier, suitable for making a safe forced landing into as well. It doesn't have to be the airfield surface. So if what's ahead of you is not suitable, it might be that you're manoeuvring or using power to get to somewhere that is more suitable. But, we kind of tend to assume that that's the airfield we've took off from. And that's probably some thinking that we need to get away from, which I think is part of the training. that the CA is very keen for us to start doing in our recurrent checks and things like that.
But what about that temptation to sort of baby an aircraft back? Partial power initially, then power comes back. We heard in that second case that meant that this pilot changed their plan. They'd found a field, they could possibly have made it, but they tried to head back to a downwind position for a tight circuit, knowing that the engine wasn't in a good way, but it was currently running. I just wonder what your thoughts are on this, because I know there is a school of thought that if you've got partial power, find a field, go for that field, turn the engine off, and go for it. Don't be tempted to try and baby the aircraft back. It could go at any time.
Yeah, absolutely, John. But you know what? It's very difficult, isn't it? Because we're all humans. We're all conditioned to save the day, save our aeroplane and things like that. So, you've been faced with this horrible bad situation, everything's gone wrong on you, and suddenly the power's come back. Our human instinct is to go, right, we've saved the day, we've recovered the situation, we can go back to what we want instinctively to be able to do. So it's if the power has been restored, it takes quite a leap of human emotion to actually go, you know what, I'm closing the throttle, I'm not accepting that, and I'm going to put this very expensive aeroplane of mine or somebody else's in a field. So it takes quite a bit of emotional commitment to do that. Don't underestimate it.
So let's talk about how pilots can prepare for such an eventuality, prior to takeoff. I think it was recognised in the AAIB report that actually a lot of airfields taking off, there aren't many options after you've taken off if you had an engine failure or partial power. What can pilots do to prepare themselves for this kind of thing?
Google Maps or other products as well, mapping are really worth it with this as well. There's two things I would observe is there is some tendency of some people to fly always from a particular airfield to sort of precondition themselves to the fact that if I have an engine failure, those are the fields I'm going into. So that's good. That's kind of valuable pre-planning and thinking, but every takeoff is going to be different. The weight of the aircraft, the environmental conditions of the day, how accurately you fly, every takeoff is going to be different. So you've got to be careful that you don't assume you can always make your preconceived field. That's one thing. You've got to take each situation, each takeoff on the day as it happens. The other thing that's worth looking at as well is that fields change. Livestock can move around, crop changes throughout the year. Sometimes fields in winter can be very waterlogged or very unsafe there as well. So it's always worth on every takeoff, I think, having a look out and saying, right, if the engine goes, what are my good field options today for the conditions of this takeoff today?
Well, thanks, Matt, for going through those two cases with me. Some interesting findings from the AAIB. Lots of talking points there about one of the biggest killers in GA, loss of control and partial power and engine failures, which can contribute to that. Coming up next, we're going to be talking about some changes and some guidance that's come out of the CAA about flight training, and it affects both flying instructors and students. So listen up for that. But first, I want to thank this episode's sponsors, Flyer Watches. Now, Flyer Watches is a new business that's been set up by pilot David Burns and his father. They wanted to give something back to the community, and the way they're doing that is they're giving 20% from the sale of most of their range of watches to fund PPL scholarships, which is a great way of giving back, I suppose. I'm wearing their Flyer Horizon watch. It's Swiss made, it's scratch resistant, water resistant, and being having Swiss timekeeping, it's obviously very precise as well. You get a 14-day return policy with every purchase and a 2-year warranty as well, and they deliver for free worldwide. Check out their full range at flyerwatches.com. So Matt, a few quick changes to training procedures affecting the qualifying cross-country test and also the revalidation training for pilots using non-Part 21 type aircraft. So Do you want to talk? This has come out in a communication to instructors that I think you and I both read. Can we talk about the qualifying cross country first? What have the CAA been saying about that?
So yes, John, this comes from Training.com, which is a publication that goes out to instructors and examiners. It is available to read on the CAA website. It's not secret. Anybody can read it. You don't have to be an instructor or examiner. And there's some interesting information in there as well. And it's where the CAA staff examiners try and clarify issues or topics, matters of the moment for instructors, examiners out there as well. One of the things there's been a fair bit of debate about is the qualifying cross-country flight requirement for the LAPL, PPL, or indeed actually the CPL as well. And there's been some nervousness, I think, from people doing these about what they actually have to fly and log. And the Training.com has clarified that the aerodromes chosen for these landings should ideally be that a straight line route between them will achieve the required distance. And that they're talking about the spirit of the flight is for pilots to apply their navigation skills to a practical route rather than just zigzagging around their local area at familiar aerodromes. But first and foremost, the requirement's to complete a flight of the distance. And so you can put any number of legs in it and you can use any appropriate turning points as well. And you don't have to be the aerodromes for the turning points as well. And what they're clarifying here is that, of course, especially with the risk of airspace infringements, the complex controlled airspace where people might be operating, pilots do have their discretion. They don't have to fly a straight line route between it there as well. Good advice as well there is that if keep a log of your routes on flight logging or commercial software, so you can keep that as a record there as well. And they've also clarified that it's ideally a requirement to complete it as a single flight, i.e. normally during the same day. But they're clarifying this should not be achieved at the expense of safety. So where you get unforeseen circumstances such as weather, illness, you even get fatigued, or you have a tech problem with the aircraft, the pilot, if they apply good decision making, good fit and error management, and take a break or take a rest, perhaps even overnight, that's fine to continue the flight like that as well. But again, the good advice is, keep a log of it, keep a record of what happened so you can clarify that if necessary. But I think this advice is kind of quite welcome, and it might kind of help close down some of the urban myths that are out there in the industry.
And there are plenty of urban myths around. The next one you wanted to talk about was Official Record Series 4. And what number was it of this official?
It is 1601, John.
This is to do, I think, Matt, is this right, in which type of aircraft you can do your revalidations in?
That's it, John. So it's all about using a non-Part 21 aeroplane or touring modes glider to conduct the dual refresher flight for the revalidation of single engine piston or TMG class ratings or even privileges on a LAPL. So this is about using permit, home built or orphaned aircraft for doing this as well. This refresher flight with a flight instructor or a CRI for the purposes of revalidation of your rating. That's what this is all about.
And why has it come about? They say that there's some urgent need to bring in this exemption.
So I think that basically when regulation has evolved, there was a bit of an unintended consequence here when previously the regulation that this goes back to is FCL 035. I won't bore people with the full length of it, but it said if the flight for the dual refresher training was done in a non-Part 21 aircraft or TMG, it must have been evaluated and authorised by the CAA, and it had to be done as part of a DTO or ATO authorisation. So, that put pretty much an unintended burden on the CAA organisations and pilots, and the effect of it was that you could fly your home built beautiful aircraft that you all the time that you're very familiar with, but then to go and do your refresher flight of an hour, you'd have to go to your local flying club and jump in a PA-28 or a Cessna that you were totally unfamiliar with to go and do your hour's instructional flight rather than doing it in your own aircraft that you fly all the time. So the CAA have quite rightly recognised that there was an unintended consequence of this regulation that was actually potentially decreasing the training value for pilots out there.
So this will be a welcome exemption now.
Very much so. So certainly those in BMAA, LAA, or other those communities as well strongly support this as well. Quite often I get asked to go and do the hour with an instructor with a pilot who owns their own aircraft or is in a group, and this gives us the ability to go and do this. Ironically, as an examiner, before, if the pilot elected to revalidate by proficiency check rather than training, I could actually go and do that flight as an examiner as a proficiency check on the non-Part 21 aircraft already. So this is just really tidying all of that up, and I think it's a good piece of work by the CAA to close this particular problematic loophole.
Well, look, that's going to bring us to the end of this briefing. I just wanted to say to you, if you've got a question for Matt, we're going to bring back this feature that I started in the briefings a while back, Ask the Instructor. Now, I use Matt and other instructors all the time to ask silly questions that I have, where I've misunderstood something or need some clarification. Matt's going to be here for us once a month, and if you've got a question you want to ask Matt, something you've heard about, don't understand, a myth you've heard that you want explained or debunked, then Matt's here. Contact me through my website and we'll rifle through those and pick some of the great ones and bring them to the briefing. Matt, thanks for being with us on the briefing today.
It's great, John. It's great to be part of this, and like I say, out and about, lots of people say how much they like these briefings and getting the plain English explanations and discussions of what's going on in regulation. So it's great to be part of it. Thanks, John.
Well, that brings us to the end of this month's Pilot Briefing podcast. My thanks to Matt for joining us. Astral Aviation Consulting, they have a wealth of resources and workshops online at astralaviationconsulting.com with some great tips to make your flying safer. And I'd also like to thank Flywatches for sponsoring this episode. Well, let me know what you think of this new format, the slightly more relaxed, unscripted format, and a conversation with Matt here. Get in touch if you've got a question for Matt, and subscribe or follow the podcast and briefing to make sure that you don't miss the next episode, which comes out next month. Until then, though, I'll say goodbye for now. Fly safely, my friends. See you soon.